Margaret Huan threaded the needle without looking. 70 years of muscle memory guided the silk through the eye in one smooth motion. Her hands moved with the precision of a surgeon, though the tremor in her fingers had grown worse over the past year. She told herself it was arthritis, nothing more. The shop smelled like it always did. Fabric softener and steam from the pressing machine, old wood, and the faint metallic tang of sewing machine oil. Outside, the afternoon sun painted long shadows across Maple Street. 3 blocks from the courthouse in a town so small everyone knew everyone's business, or thought they did. Margaret had owned Juan's Tailoring and Alterations for 42 years. Before that, she worked in a factory in Pennsylvania. Before that was complicated. The shop was small but well organized. 3 sewing machines lined the back wall, each one a different model from different decades. The newest was from 1987. The oldest, a black cast-iron Singer, had been her grandmother's. It still worked perfectly. Margaret used it for delicate work that required precision the modern machines couldn't quite match. Rolls of fabric stood in racks against one wall. Cottons and silks and wools and synthetic blends. Thread spools lined another wall, organized by color in a rainbow that stretched from pure white through every shade imaginable to deep black. Customers often commented on how she could find any color they needed. They didn't know she could match colors by sight, a skill that came from years of working with subtle variations that mattered more than people realized. The walls held framed photographs. Her late husband, Robert, a quiet man who had loved her for 40 years and never asked too many questions about her past. Their daughter, Sarah, who had died of cancer 5 years ago at the age of 52. Family vacations, holiday gatherings, the ordinary documentation of an ordinary life. That was the version of Margaret that most people knew. Quiet widow, devoted mother who had outlived her child, skilled tailor, pillar of the small community. The bell above the door chimed. Margaret didn't look up immediately. She finished the stitch she was working on, a careful reinforcement along the hem of a wedding dress. The bride would pick it up Friday. Margaret had hemmed her mother's wedding dress 30 years ago. Time moved in strange circles in a small town. "I'll be right with you," she said. Footsteps approached the counter, measured, deliberate, the kind of walk that suggested military training or law enforcement. Margaret had learned to read gaits decades ago. This person wasn't local. She set down the wedding dress and looked up. The man was young, late 20s maybe, athletic build, short sandy hair, clean-shaven. He wore a dark gray suit that fit too well to be off the rack. His shoes were expensive. His watch was simple, but probably cost more than Margaret's monthly rent. Everything about him screamed federal government. "Mrs. Huan?" he asked. "Miss," Margaret corrected automatically. "Though I don't use that much either. Just Margaret is fine. My name is Lucas Brennan. I'm with the Defense Department's Historical Documentation Division." Margaret's hands stilled. Her face remained neutral. 70 years of practice had taught her how to keep her expression blank when necessary. "Historical documentation," she repeated. "That's an interesting job title." "It's mostly boring," Lucas said. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Tracking down old records, verifying documentation, making sure our archives are accurate." "And what brings you to my shop?" Lucas reached into his briefcase and pulled out a manila folder. He set it on the counter between them. The folder was old, the edges were worn. The paper had that distinctive yellow tint that came from decades in storage. "We're working on a project related to the Korean War," Lucas said. "Specifically military support personnel who served between 1952 and 1954. Margaret's pulse quickened. She kept her breathing even. "That was a long time ago." "Yes, ma'am, but some records from that period have recently been declassified, and we're trying to identify individuals who may have served in certain specialized capacities." "I was a child during the Korean War," Margaret said. Her voice was steady. "I didn't serve. No, ma'am, but according to our records, a Margaret Chen, born 1930, served as an Army nurse attached to mobile Army surgical hospital units near the 38th parallel between January 1953 and July 1953. The room felt smaller suddenly, the air thicker. That's not me, Margaret said. I was born in 1935. I'd have been too young. Lucas opened the folder. He pulled out a photograph, black and white, grainy. It showed a group of nurses in front of a tent. The women wore fatigues. Their faces were tired. In the back row, third from the left, stood a young woman who looked remarkably like Margaret might have looked 50 years ago. "Is this you?" Lucas asked. Margaret looked at the photograph. She had not seen this image in decades. She had hoped never to see it again. The young woman in the photograph was 23 years old. She had black hair pulled back tightly, military regulation style. She had dark brown eyes that looked tired but determined. She was small, maybe 5'2", dwarfed by the other nurses in the photograph. She wore an Army nurse uniform with a white armband bearing a red cross. Her sleeves were rolled up despite the cold. Her hands hung at her sides, but Margaret could see they were bandaged, probably from the surgery work they'd been doing all day. She remembered the day this photograph was taken. February 14th, 1953. Valentine's Day. Their commanding officer had insisted on taking a group photo for morale. It had felt absurd at the time. They had just lost 3 patients that morning. The photograph showed exhausted women trying to smile. "That could be anyone," Margaret said. "The woman in this photograph was wearing a jade pendant," Lucas said. "Family heirloom, distinctive carving, very specific. The kind of thing someone might keep their entire life." His eyes dropped to Margaret's neck, to the small jade pendant she wore on a thin gold chain. The pendant her grandmother had given her in 1948, the year before her grandmother died. The pendant she had worn through war and peace and everything in between. Margaret's hand moved unconsciously to touch the pendant. She caught herself, lowered her hand. "Lots of people have jade pendants," she said. "Not like that one," Lucas replied. "The carving is unique. It's a traditional Korean longevity symbol mixed with a Chinese phoenix design. It was noted in your service file. We have a photograph that shows it clearly." He pulled out another photograph. This one was a close-up, black and white but still showing detail. It showed a young woman in profile. The jade pendant was clearly visible against her uniform collar. The carving was unmistakable. "I don't have a service file," Margaret said. "Actually, you do. It was sealed for 70 years under the Army's Cold War Intelligence Documentation Act. It was declassified 6 months ago." Lucas pulled out another document. This one was typed on old paper, official military letterhead. Margaret could see her name at the top, her real name, the name she had not used in nearly 50 years. Chen, Margaret Sue Hyun. Born April 3, 1930, San Francisco, California. Parents Chen Wei Hong and Chen Park Sun Yi, both deceased. Education, San Francisco State Teachers College, 1948-1950. Nursing training, Letterman Army Hospital, 1950-1952. Enlisted, January 7, 1952. Specialty, Army Nurse Corps. Secondary assignment, Intelligence Operations, Operation Needle Thread. Status, classified sealed until 2023. "I'd like you to leave," Margaret said. "Mrs. Huan, I'd like you to leave now." Lucas studied her face. He seemed to be making some kind of calculation. Finally, he nodded. "I'll leave this information with you," he said. He placed a business card on the counter next to the folder. "If you decide you want to talk, please call me. There are people who deserve to know what you did, what you sacrificed." He walked to the door, paused with his hand on the handle. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "what you did mattered, more than you know. My grandfather served in Korea. He survived because of intelligence that came through medical units. Specifically, his unit was warned about an ambush in June 1953. The warning came in the form of stitches sewn into a uniform that came back from repair. He lived to come home, to have a family, to have me. Someone like you saved his life. I've spent my career trying to find those people, trying to thank them. Please think about it." Then he was gone. The bell chimed. The door closed. Margaret stood alone in her shop, staring at the folder on her counter. She should throw it away, should burn it, should pretend this conversation never happened. Instead, she opened the folder. Inside were documents she had not seen in 70 years, personnel files, mission reports, deployment records, and photographs. So many photographs of people she had known, people she had served with, people who had died. There was a photograph of her standing next to a jeep, medical supplies loaded in the back. She remembered the day. They were preparing to evacuate wounded soldiers from a forward position. She had been 23 years old, exhausted, frightened, but determined. Another photograph showed her inside a surgical tent, hands covered in blood, exhaustion written across her young face. She remembered that day too. They had received 23 casualties in a single afternoon after a mortar attack. She had assisted with surgery for 11 hours straight. By the end, her hands had been shaking so badly she couldn't hold a needle. The chief surgeon had ordered her to bed. She had collapsed before reaching her cot. Another photograph showed her receiving a commendation from a colonel whose name she had long forgotten, a medal pinned to her uniform. But it had been a cover ceremony. The medal was for exemplary nursing service. The real reason for the commendation was classified. She had successfully extracted critical intelligence from a North Korean defector who only spoke Korean. The intelligence had led to the prevention of a major attack on U.S. positions. She remembered the colonel's words as he pinned the medal. "Lieutenant Chen, the Army is grateful for your service. Both kinds." Both kinds. He had known. They all knew, the ones who needed to know. And there, at the bottom of the stack, was a document that made her hands begin to shake. Mission Report, July 11th, 1953. Operation, Intelligence Gathering, Sector 7. Personnel, PVT Walsh, Jennifer, CPL Santos, Michael, LT Park, James. Status, missing in action. Last known position, 2 km north of checkpoint Charlie. Last contact, 23:47 hours. Presumed captured by enemy forces. Recovery status, impossible. Area under heavy enemy control. Recommended action, personnel to be listed as killed in action. Families to be notified of combat deaths. No details of actual mission to be disclosed. Operation Needle Thread, permanently terminated. All operatives to be exfiltrated within 48 hours. Margaret sank onto her stool. She had known these people. Jennifer had been her bunkmate for 6 months. They had shared a tent, shared rations, shared secrets in the dark when artillery thundered in the distance. Jennifer had taught her how to do her hair quickly in the morning because Margaret had been hopeless at it. Margaret had taught Jennifer some Korean phrases for use in the field. They had read each other's letters from home. They had cried together when Jennifer's brother had been killed in a training accident in February. Michael had taught her how to encode coordinates into hem stitches, how to make the patterns look like natural repairs. He had been patient with her, never made her feel stupid when she made mistakes. He had carried a photograph of his little sister Ruth in his pocket. He had talked about how he was going to open a restaurant when he got home, Filipino-Korean fusion. Nobody was doing that yet, he said. He was going to be the first. James had been her team leader, the one who had recruited her into the operation, who had trained her, who had trusted her with work that could get them all killed. He had a wife back home named Yuna. He carried a photograph of her in his pocket. They had married just 2 weeks before he deployed. She had been pregnant when he left. He had never met his daughter. He had been planning to fly home as soon as the war ended, meet his baby for the first time, hold her in his arms. They had disappeared on a Wednesday. Margaret remembered because she'd been scheduled to go on that mission. She was supposed to be the 3rd member of the team that night, but she'd been pulled at the last minute to help with an emergency surgery. A soldier had come in with shrapnel wounds that required all available hands. She had spent 7 hours in surgery, while Jennifer, Michael, and James went into the dark without her. She had lived because someone else needed stitches. They had died because she hadn't been there. The guilt was not new. Margaret had carried it for 70 years, heavy and sharp as broken glass. But seeing it written down, seeing their names in official documentation, seeing the cold clinical language that reduced their deaths to missing in action and recommended action, made it fresh again, raw again, like a wound that had never really healed, just been covered over. She thought about Una Park. She would be in her 90s now if she was still alive. Margaret had often wondered what had happened to her. Had she remarried? Had she raised her daughter alone? Did the daughter know her father had been a hero? Margaret had wanted to reach out so many times over the years, to write a letter, to explain, to at least tell Una that James had loved her, had carried her photograph everywhere, had talked about meeting their baby. But she couldn't. She wasn't supposed to exist. Margaret Chen was supposed to be dead, so Una had never known. The bell chimed. Margaret quickly wiped her eyes and looked up. An older man stood in the doorway, 60-something, gray beard, kind eyes. He carried an old military duffel bag over his shoulder. "I'm sorry," Margaret said, her voice not quite steady. "I'm actually just about to close for the day." "That's all right," the man said. "I'm not here for tailoring. My name is Dale Pritchard. I think we need to talk." Something in his tone made Margaret pause. About what? Dale set the duffel bag on the counter. Slowly, carefully, he unzipped it. Inside was a military uniform, olive drab, worn, faded with age. The fabric had that particular texture that came from decades in storage, slightly stiff, slightly musty. "This belonged to my father," Dale said. "He served in Korea. Staff Sergeant Edward Pritchard, 7th Infantry Division, Charlie Company. He died 3 years ago. When I was going through his things, I found this uniform in a trunk in his attic, and I found something unusual." He pulled the jacket out and turned it inside out. Along the collar lining, Margaret could see stitches, tiny, precise, deliberate. The pattern was unmistakable to someone who knew what to look for, the same pattern she had used. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. "My father never talked much about the war," Dale continued. "He had nightmares for years, would wake up shouting coordinates, but he never explained them, never told us what he'd seen or done. He drank too much. He pushed people away. My mother divorced him in 1968. He lived alone for the last 30 years of his life. But near the end, when the dementia was getting bad, when his filters were gone, he would sometimes mention a nurse, a young Korean-American woman who had saved his unit." Dale looked at Margaret intently. "He said she'd sewn a message into his uniform that warned them about an ambush. Said if it wasn't for her, his entire company would have walked into a trap. Said over 50 men would have died that day. He said her name was Margaret, and he said he'd always wondered what happened to her, wondered if she'd made it home, wondered if she knew how many lives she'd saved, wondered if anyone had ever thanked her." Margaret couldn't speak. Her throat had closed. Her eyes were burning. "I didn't understand what he meant," Dale said. "Thought it was just the dementia talking. Random war stories mixed with confusion. But then I saw the news this morning." He pulled out his phone and showed her a news website. The headline read, "Korean War Intelligence Program Declassified. Nurses coded messages in uniform stitches." "You're one of them," Dale said. It wasn't a question. "You're the Margaret my father talked about." Margaret nodded slowly. She didn't trust herself to speak yet. "Can you tell me about it?" Dale asked gently. "My father died not knowing if you were still alive, not knowing if you ever got the recognition you deserved, not knowing if his gratitude ever reached you. I'd like to know. For him. So I can tell him, wherever he is, that I found you. That you're alive. That you're being honored." Margaret looked at the uniform, at the stitches she had sewn 70 years ago, with hands that hadn't yet learned to shake, at the code that had saved lives, at the physical proof that what she'd done had mattered. "Your father's name was Edward Pritchard?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, ma'am." "I remember him," Margaret said. The memories came flooding back now, sharp and clear as if they'd happened yesterday instead of 7 decades ago. "He was with the 7th Infantry Division, Charlie Company. His unit was scheduled to move through a mountain pass on July 8, 1953. They were going to establish a forward observation post on the ridge overlooking the Imjin River. How did you know that? We'd received intelligence from a local informant, a Korean civilian who'd seen North Korean troops mining the pass 2 days earlier. He'd counted at least 40 mines, and he'd seen soldiers taking up positions on the ridges on both sides. It was a perfect kill box. Your father's unit would have been slaughtered. How did you get that information to him? Margaret touched the stitches on the uniform collar. His uniform had been sent to our MASH unit for repair. There was a tear in the sleeve from barbed wire. I was assigned to fix it. While I was doing the repair work, I encoded the coordinates of the mine locations and enemy positions into the collar stitching. When the uniform was returned to him, there was a note pinned inside that said to report to Intelligence Officer Captain Morrison for route updates. The intelligence officer knew how to read the stitches. And they avoided the ambush? They took a different route, went 5 miles east, crossed at a different point. The North Koreans waited in that pass for 3 days before they realized the Americans weren't coming. By then, your father's unit had established their observation post and radioed in the enemy positions. Artillery took them out, no American casualties. Dale's eyes were wet now. He never knew your name, never knew what you looked like. He just knew a nurse had saved his life. He talked about you like you were an angel, like you'd appeared out of nowhere to save him and then vanished. I was just doing my job. You were doing more than that, Dale said firmly. You were risking your life. If the enemy had figured out what you were doing, if they'd captured you, if they'd broken the code. 3 of our people were captured, Margaret said quietly. They were tortured, interrogated, killed. The enemy never figured out the full scope of the operation, but they knew something was happening. They knew we were passing intelligence somehow. They just didn't know how. Is that why the program was shut down? Yes. It became too dangerous. After Jennifer, Michael, and James were captured, the Army pulled all of us out within 48 hours, gave us new identities, new birth certificates, new social security numbers, made us disappear. They said it was for our own protection. Said if word got out about what we'd done, we'd be targets for the rest of our lives. That must have been hard. It was necessary, Margaret said. Her voice had gone flat, the way it always did when she talked about things that hurt too much to feel. Or at least, that's what we were told. We didn't have a choice. The Army gave us each a new identity and a city to move to. We couldn't contact each other, couldn't stay in touch with our families from before, couldn't tell anyone who we really were or what we'd really done. We just had to disappear, become someone else, live a lie for the rest of our lives. And now a man from the Defense Department shows up at my shop with declassified files and tells me I can finally tell the truth. Margaret laughed, but there was no humor in it. 70 years too late for most of us. Most of the others are dead now, or have dementia, or don't remember clearly anymore. I'm one of the last ones left who can still tell the story. Dale reached across the counter and gently took her hand. His hand was warm, steady. It's not too late for my father. Because of you, I can visit his grave tomorrow and tell him I found you. I can tell him you made it home, that you built a life, that you're being recognized for what you did, that his gratitude finally reached you. That matters. Even if he's not here to know it, it matters. Margaret squeezed his hand. She couldn't speak. The tears were coming now, hot and fast, 70 years of them, and she couldn't stop them. They sat in silence for a long moment, Margaret crying quietly, Dale holding her hand, the afternoon sun slanting through the shop windows and painting everything in gold. Finally, Margaret wiped her eyes and took a shaky breath. "Would you like some tea?" she asked. "I have a small kitchen upstairs. We could talk more. I could tell you about your father, about the work we did, about everything." "I'd like that very much," Dale said. They spent the next 3 hours in Margaret's small apartment above the shop. She made tea, the way her grandmother had taught her, with leaves she imported from Korea once a year. They sat at her kitchen table, and she told him everything. She told him about arriving in Korea in January 1953, about the brutal cold that made her bones ache, about the endless stream of wounded soldiers, about the exhaustion that became her normal state. She told him about Captain Morrison pulling her aside 3 weeks after she arrived, about the offer to do intelligence work, about saying yes without really understanding what she was agreeing to. She told him about the training, how they'd taught her to encode information into stitching patterns, how different patterns meant different things, how a certain stitch sequence meant enemy troops, how another meant artillery positions, how another meant supply routes, how the stitches had to look like natural repairs, had to blend in, had to be invisible to anyone who wasn't trained to see them. She told him about the missions, how she would slip out of the MASH unit at night in civilian clothes, her nurse's uniform hidden in a bag, how she would meet informants in villages, in rice paddies, in abandoned buildings, how she would memorize everything they told her, how she would return to the unit and spend hours encoding that information into uniforms that came through for repair. She told him about the fear, the constant gnawing fear that she would be discovered, that someone would notice the patterns in the stitches, that an informant would be captured and would give up her name under torture, that she would make a mistake and people would die because of it. And she told him about the purpose, the bone-deep certainty that what she was doing mattered, that the intelligence she was gathering was saving lives, that every message she encoded was worth the risk. "I did 37 missions," Margaret said. 37 times I coded information that was used to save American lives. Your father's unit was number 23. I encoded the coordinates on July 7th. The uniform was returned to him on July 8th. He changed his route that afternoon. "Do you remember all of them?" Dale asked. "All 37? Every single one. Every date. Every piece of intelligence. Every life saved. I've carried them all for 70 years. She told him about specific missions. A piece of intelligence in March about enemy supply lines that had allowed American forces to disrupt food shipments to a North Korean division. A piece of intelligence in April about a planned attack on a refugee camp that had allowed civilians to be evacuated in time. A piece of intelligence in May about North Korean officers visiting a forward position that had allowed for a precision artillery strike. "How many lives total?" Dale asked. "Do you have any sense?" Margaret thought about it. "I never tried to calculate, but Captain Morrison once told me that my work alone had probably saved over 1,000 American lives, and there were 33 other operatives doing the same work, so tens of thousands, maybe more. The whole operation probably saved more lives than any other intelligence program of the war. And it was all secret, forever, or so we thought." As the sun set and the kitchen grew dark, Margaret told him about July 11th, 1953, about the mission that ended everything. "Jennifer, Michael, and James were going to meet an informant in a village 3 kilometers north of our position," she said. "The informant had information about a major North Korean offensive being planned. If we could get the details, we could warn command, prevent a massacre. I was supposed to go with them. But at the last minute, a soldier came in with critical injuries. Shrapnel had severed an artery. Every available hand was needed in surgery. They told me to stay. Sent Jennifer, Michael, and James without me." Her voice cracked. "They never came back. We found out later they'd been ambushed. The informant had been compromised, probably tortured into setting a trap. Jennifer, Michael, and James walked right into it. They were captured. The North Koreans interrogated them for 6 days, trying to find out what they knew, who they worked with, how the intelligence network operated. On the 7th day, they were executed, buried in unmarked graves somewhere near the Yalu River." "That wasn't your fault," Dale said gently. "Wasn't it? If I'd been there, maybe they would have escaped. Maybe I would have seen the ambush. Maybe I could have done something. Or maybe you'd be dead too. Maybe that soldier with the severed artery would have bled out if you hadn't been there to help save him. You can't know. You can't carry that guilt. I've carried it for 70 years. I don't know how to put it down." Dale was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My father carried guilt too. About the men in his unit who died. about decisions he made, about people he couldn't save. He carried it until the day he died, and it poisoned him, made him angry, made him drink, made him push away the people who loved him. Don't make that mistake. Don't let the guilt poison the rest of your life. Margaret looked at him. This stranger, who had walked into her shop a few hours ago, and who now felt like an old friend. How did you turn out so wise with a father like that? Dale smiled sadly. I learned what not to do, and I learned that everyone who serves carries something heavy home with them. The question is whether you let it crush you, or whether you find a way to bear it. They talked until well past midnight. Dale told her about his own life. He had served in the army himself, in the Gulf War, came home with his own demons but had been determined not to become his father, had gone to college on the GI Bill, had become a high school teacher, history. He had taught generations of students about wars his father had refused to discuss. I always thought he was a coward for not being able to talk about it, Dale said. Now I understand he wasn't. He was just broken, and nobody knew how to put him back together. War breaks people, Margaret said, even when they survive, especially when they survive while others don't. When Dale finally left, Margaret felt lighter than she had in decades, like she'd been carrying a weight for so long she'd forgotten it was there, and now someone had helped her set it down, if only for a moment. She slept that night, really slept, for the first time in years. The next morning, her phone rang at 7. It was Lucas Brennan. Miss Chen, I'm sorry to call so early, but something's happened. The story broke overnight. Someone leaked it to the press. Every news outlet is running with it. They're calling it the greatest untold story of the Korean War. They're trying to identify the surviving operatives. Your name is going to come out, probably in the next few hours. Margaret's stomach dropped. What do you mean my name is going to come out? The declassified documents list all 34 operatives. Journalists have access to them now. They're matching names to current addresses. It's only a matter of time before someone shows up at your door. Can you stop them? No, ma'am, freedom of the press, but I can offer you protection. We can move you to a secure location, keep you safe from the media circus until things calm down. I'm not hiding again, Margaret said. The words surprised her, but they felt right. I've hidden for 70 years. I'm done hiding. Then let me help you manage this. Let me send a team to document your story properly before the press gets to you. Let us control the narrative. Make sure your truth gets told the way you want it told. Margaret thought about Jennifer and Michael and James, about Dale's father, about all the families who had lost people and never known the truth, about the 17 other survivors who were still alive, scattered across the country, probably getting phone calls just like this one. All right, she said, but I want to tell all of it, not just my part. I want to tell their stories too, the ones who died, the ones who can't speak for themselves anymore. Deal, Lucas said. I'll have a crew at your shop by noon. Is that acceptable? Yes. Margaret hung up. She stood in her apartment, looking at the morning sun streaming through the windows, and thought about what came next. 70 years of silence, and now, in a matter of hours, the truth. She went downstairs to the shop, unlocked the door, flipped the sign to closed, sat at her workbench and waited. At 11:30 Dale arrived. He'd seen the news, brought coffee and bagels, sat with her while she waited. You don't have to be here, Margaret said. Yes, I do, Dale replied. You shouldn't be alone for this. At noon exactly, Lucas arrived with a film crew, 3 people, professional, respectful. They set up cameras and lights, arranged the shop to look natural. Positioned Margaret in her usual spot behind the counter, the military uniform with the coded stitches spread on the workspace in front of her. Whenever you're ready, Lucas said softly. Margaret looked at the camera, took a breath, touched the jade pendant around her neck, and began. My name is Margaret Soo-hyun Chen. I was born in San Francisco, California, on April 3, 1930. My parents were immigrants from Korea. My father came in 1924, my mother in 1925. They met at a Korean church in San Francisco. My father worked in a laundry, my mother worked as a seamstress. They had me, their only child, and they wanted me to have a better life than they had, so they made sure I went to school, made sure I spoke English perfectly, made sure I learned everything I could about America. She paused. But they also made sure I never forgot Korea. They made sure I spoke Korean at home, read Korean books, understood Korean culture. They told me about the village in Korea where my grandparents still lived, about the country they had left but never stopped loving. When the Korean War started in 1950, I knew I had to help. I joined the army as a nurse. She talked for 4 hours. She described everything, her training, her deployment, her recruitment into Operation Needle Thread, the coding system, the missions, the constant fear and the unshakable purpose. She talked about the 37 pieces of intelligence she'd gathered and encoded, about the ambushes prevented, about the artillery strikes that had been possible because of coordinates she'd sewn into jacket linings, about the lives saved, and she talked about the 3 who had died. Private Jennifer Walsh was 21 years old, Margaret said. Her voice was steady, despite the tears streaming down her face. She spoke Korean fluently because her parents had been missionaries in Seoul before the war. She was kind. She was brave. She had a laugh that could light up a tent, even when everything was terrible. She wanted to be a teacher when the war ended. She used to tell me about her plans. She was going to teach high school history. She wanted to make sure students understood what their parents and grandparents had been through. She was captured on July 11, 1953, and executed on July 17th. She died a hero, and for 70 years nobody knew. Corporal Michael Santos was 24. His mother was Korean. His father was Filipino-American. He grew up in Los Angeles speaking 3 languages. He taught me how to encode wind speed and temperature into buttonhole stitches, so pilots would know flight conditions. He taught me how to make my stitches look natural, how to vary the tension so they wouldn't stand out. He was patient and funny and homesick. He had a little sister named Ruth he carried a photograph of. He wanted to open a restaurant when he got home, Filipino-Korean fusion food. He had recipes worked out. He showed them to me. He was captured with Jennifer. He died trying to protect her. Nobody knew. Lieutenant James Park was 28. He was Korean-American, first generation, born in New York. He was our team leader. He recruited me, trained me, trusted me with work that could get us all killed. He had a wife named Yuna. They had married just 2 weeks before he deployed. She was pregnant when he left. He never met his daughter. He carried a photograph of Yuna in his pocket. He was planning to fly home as soon as the war ended, meet his baby for the first time, hold her in his arms. He died trying to help Jennifer and Michael escape. His daughter grew up never knowing her father was a hero. Nobody knew. Margaret looked directly into the camera. For 70 years, nobody knew their names. Nobody knew what they sacrificed. Nobody knew they died serving their country in a way that most soldiers never have to. I'm telling their story now because they can't. Because they deserve to be remembered. Because what they did mattered. Because silence shouldn't be the final answer. When the interview finally ended, Margaret felt hollowed out, but also clearer, like she'd been carrying something toxic for so long it had become part of her, and now it was gone, and she could breathe properly for the first time in decades. Lucas thanked her, told her the footage would be edited and released in conjunction with an upcoming White House ceremony, told her all surviving Operation Needle Thread operatives would be invited to receive the Intelligence Star. "How many of us are left?" Margaret asked. 17 that we've confirmed, but we're still searching. Some people disappeared so thoroughly we can't find them. Some may be using different names. Some may have died without us knowing. When is the ceremony? 3 months. The president wants to do this right. Full military honors, public recognition, press coverage. The whole country will see it. After Lucas and the crew left, Margaret and Dale sat in the quiet shop. "How do you feel?" Dale asked. Margaret thought about it. Scared, relieved, guilty that it took so long, angry that the others didn't live to see this, grateful that I did. All of that makes sense. What happens now? Now you become famous, Dale said with a slight smile. Now everyone knows. Now you don't get to be anonymous anymore. He was right. The documentary aired 3 days later on every major news network. Within hours, Margaret's story had gone viral. Her face was on every news website. Her shop was flooded with visitors. Reporters camped outside. Cameras clicked every time she stepped outside. The phone rang constantly, interview requests, book deals, speaking invitations. Dale fielded most of them, protecting Margaret from the worst of the chaos. But some visitors she wanted to see. 4 days after the documentary aired, an elderly woman came to the shop. She was maybe 85, fragile, but her eyes were sharp. "Margaret Chen?" she asked. "Yes." The woman's eyes filled with tears. "My name is Ruth Santos. I'm Michael Santos's younger sister." Margaret's breath caught. Ruth stepped forward, leaning heavily on her cane. "I was 14 when Michael disappeared. The army told us he died in combat. That was all. No details, no body, no grave, just gone. For 70 years I've wondered. For 70 years I've wanted to know what really happened." "I'm so sorry." "Don't apologize," Ruth interrupted. "I came to thank you. I saw your interview. You told me what the army never did. You told me my brother was a hero. You told me he died trying to protect someone. You gave me the truth I've needed my whole life." They sat together for 2 hours. Margaret told Ruth everything she remembered about Michael, his kindness, his humor, the way he'd talk about his mother's cooking and how he couldn't wait to go home and have her lumpia again, the way he'd hum while he worked, the way he'd been patient with her when she was learning the coding system, never making her feel stupid when she made mistakes. "He talked about you all the time," Margaret said. "His little sister Ruthie. He carried your picture, showed it to everyone, said you were going to be a doctor someday." "I became a nurse," Ruth said. "Like you. I wanted to be like my brother, wanted to help people the way he did. I've spent my whole life trying to honor him without ever really knowing what he'd done. He would be so proud of you." When Ruth left, she hugged Margaret for a long time. "Thank you for remembering him," she whispered. "Thank you for making sure he wasn't forgotten." The next day, a phone call came. From California. From a woman who introduced herself as Una Park. Margaret's hand went numb. She nearly dropped the phone. "You knew my husband," Una said. Her voice was older, thinner than Margaret remembered, but unmistakably the same voice she had heard in audio recordings James had played for her. "I saw your interview. You spoke about him. You said his name. You told my daughter and my granddaughter what he really did. After 70 years. Mrs. Park, my daughter Sun-hee found me yesterday. We had a long talk. For the first time she understands. For the first time she knows her father wasn't just a name on a wall. He was a hero. He died doing something that mattered. Thank you for that." Margaret couldn't speak. She was crying too hard. "I would like to meet you," Una continued. "If you would be willing. I have questions about my husband, about the work he did, about the man he was at the end. Would you tell me?" "Yes," Margaret managed. "Yes, of course. Anything you want to know." A week later, Una flew from California with her daughter Sun-hee and granddaughter Anna. They came to Margaret's shop. They spent 3 days together. Margaret told them everything she remembered about James, his humor, his leadership, his love for his wife, the way he had carried Una's photograph everywhere, the way he had talked constantly about meeting his baby. Sun-hee, now 71 years old, listened to stories about a father she had never known. She wept when Margaret told her how James had spoken of her. He used to say he didn't even know yet whether his baby would be a boy or a girl, Margaret said. But he knew he would love her either way. He said he hoped you'd have your mother's eyes. He said your mother had the most beautiful eyes. Sun-hee touched her own face. "I do have my mother's eyes. People always told me that. I never knew if my father would have thought so too. Now I know." Una had brought something with her, a small leather pouch. Inside was a photograph. It showed James in his army uniform, his arm around Una, both of them smiling. Una was visibly pregnant. The photograph was dated April 1953, 3 months before he died. This was the last photograph we took together, Una said, before he deployed. He carried a copy of this with him. They sent it back to me with his other personal effects. I have looked at it every day for 70 years, wondering what he was thinking about when he died, whether he was thinking of me, of the baby. Margaret looked at the photograph for a long time. He was thinking of you, she said. Always. Every day, every night, he was thinking of you. I can tell you that with absolute certainty. Una pressed the photograph into Margaret's hands. I want you to have a copy, to remember him with. You served beside him. You were with him in his last weeks. You knew him in ways I couldn't. You are family now, like a sister-in-law, like a part of him I never got to meet. Margaret hugged her. They cried together. Sunhee and Anna joined them. 4 generations of women connected by one man's sacrifice and one woman's courage to tell the truth. More family members came. Jennifer Walsh's granddaughter, a U.S. Army captain named Sarah Walsh, who was serving in Afghanistan when the news broke. She flew home on emergency leave to meet Margaret, James Park's elderly sister, calling from a nursing home in California. The daughter of another operative who had died of cancer in 1987 without ever being able to tell his family what he'd really done in Korea. Each conversation was healing. Each story shared was a weight lifted. Each truth told was a wrong partially righted. 3 weeks after the documentary, Margaret received a phone call from an unfamiliar number. Miss Chen, my name is Colonel Nathaniel Price. I'm retired now, but in 1953 I was a lieutenant attached to I-Corps Intelligence. I was one of the officers who decoded the messages you sent. Margaret's hand tightened on the phone. Colonel, I've wanted to thank you for 70 years. The information you provided in June 1953 about enemy artillery positions helped us plan a defensive operation that saved over 300 American lives. Your work wasn't just valuable, it was extraordinary. And I've lived with the guilt of knowing you were never acknowledged for it. You were following orders. That doesn't make it right. I'm calling because I have something that belongs to you, something I was supposed to give you in 1953, but the operation shut down before I could. I've kept it all these years. May I bring it to you? Of course. Colonel Price arrived the next day. He was elderly, moving slowly with a cane, but his back was straight and his eyes were clear. He came to attention when he saw Margaret and saluted. At ease, Colonel, Margaret said softly. Please. He lowered his hand, reached into his jacket and pulled out a small wooden box. This is for you. Margaret opened it. Inside was a medal, the Bronze Star, and a citation card. For meritorious service in a combat zone. June-July 1953. Intelligence operations that directly resulted in the preservation of American lives. Awarded to First Lieutenant Margaret Chen, U.S. Army Nurse Corps. It's not official, Colonel Price said. The operation was too classified for official recognition, but a group of us who knew what you'd done, we pooled our resources and had these made. There are 34 of them. 1 for each operative. I've been holding yours, hoping someday I'd get the chance to give it to you. Margaret lifted the medal from the box. It was heavy, real. After 70 years of nothing, this small piece of metal felt like everything. The others, she said, the other medals. I've given out 17 over the years, to operatives I was able to track down. The rest, he paused. I don't know where they are, lost to time, I suppose, or waiting for people who will never claim them. Jennifer, Michael, and James. I have theirs. I've kept them, hoping maybe someday someone from their families would come forward. I know their families now, Margaret said. I can give them to them. Colonel Price's eyes grew wet. That would mean everything. Thank you. They talked for hours. The colonel told her about operations she'd supported, about battles that had been won because of intelligence she'd provided, about men who had lived because she had sewn coordinates into a jacket lining or encoded troop movements into hemstitches. You saved my life too, he said. July 14th, 1953, you sent intelligence about enemy patrol patterns. We used that information to plan a reconnaissance mission. If we'd gone the route we originally planned, we would have run straight into a company-sized ambush. Instead, we went around, completed our mission, all came home, because of you." When he left, he pressed the wooden box into her hands. "You earned this. You've always deserved it. I'm just sorry it took so long." That night, Margaret sat in her apartment holding the medal. The jade pendant lay next to it on the table. 2 pieces of her past, 2 pieces of proof that Margaret Chen and Margaret Huan were the same person, that she didn't have to choose between them anymore. The weeks continued to pass in a blur. More interviews, more visitors, more stories shared. The media attention gradually began to fade, but the impact remained. Schools invited her to speak. She talked to high school students about service and sacrifice, about doing the right thing even when it's hard, about carrying the weight of secrets and the relief of finally telling the truth. A publisher offered her a book deal. She accepted, spent months working with a writer, telling her story in detail, making sure every name was spelled correctly, every date was accurate, every truth was preserved. The book was titled The Tailor's Needle: My 70 Years of Silence. It would become a bestseller, and through it all, Dale was there, managing her schedule, screening calls, making sure she ate and slept and didn't get completely overwhelmed by the chaos her life had become. "Why are you doing this?" she asked him one evening. "You didn't sign up to be my manager." "My father died without ever being able to thank you," Dale said simply. "This is how I thank you, by making sure you're taken care of, by making sure your story gets told right, by being the friend you need." 3 months after the documentary aired, Margaret flew to Washington, D.C. for the White House ceremony. She met the other 16 survivors at a hotel the night before. They gathered in a conference room, 17 old people who had carried the same secret for 7 decades. They recognized something in each other immediately, a kinship that went beyond words, a shared understanding of what it meant to serve in silence, to carry the weight of lives saved and lives lost, to disappear and rebuild and never speak of what came before. One woman, Helen Park, was Lieutenant James Park's younger sister. She'd been 12 when he died, spent 70 years wondering what had happened to her brother. "I was too young to understand when he died," Helen said to Margaret. "I didn't understand why he was gone. I didn't understand why the army couldn't tell us anything. For 70 years I've been angry. But now I know. Now I understand. And I can let go of the anger." Another survivor was Thomas Yee. He was 91 years old. He had served as a medic. He had been one of the men who had originally trained Margaret in the coding system. "You were one of my students," he said to her. "I remember you. You were the best of them, the fastest learner, the most precise. I always knew you would do great work." "Thomas," Margaret said, her voice trembling, "I thought you were dead. I thought everyone from the training program was gone." "Almost everyone is. There are only 3 of us left from that group. The army hid us well." A woman named Sunmi Park, no relation to James, had been an interpreter. She had translated for informants. She told Margaret about a mission they had worked on together in May 1953. Margaret had encoded the intelligence Sunmi had translated. Together, they had saved an entire company. "I've thought about you every day for 70 years, Sunmi said, wondering if you survived, if you were okay, if you remembered me. Now I know." They talked deep into the night, comparing experiences, sharing memories, finding comfort in the fact that they weren't alone anymore, that someone else understood. The ceremony took place the next day in the Rose Garden. It was a beautiful morning, clear and warm, the kind of day that felt like a gift. The president spoke about sacrifice and service, about people who had done extraordinary work in extraordinary times and never received recognition, about a debt that could never be fully repaid, but could at least be acknowledged. Then, one by one, the 17 survivors were called forward. One by one they walked to the podium. One by one they received the Intelligence Star. When Margaret's name was called, she walked forward on legs that shook. The president placed the medal around her neck, shook her hand, looked her in the eyes. "Thank you for your service," the president said. "And I'm sorry it took us so long to say it." Margaret nodded. She couldn't speak. Her throat was too tight. But the ceremony wasn't finished. The president gestured to a group standing off to the side. "We have some special guests today, family members of the 3 operatives who gave their lives in service to Operation Needle Thread." Captain Sarah Walsh stepped forward. Jennifer's granddaughter, she wore her Army uniform with pride. Ruth Santos came forward, leaning on her cane, moving slowly but with determination. Una Park came forward with Sun Hee, supporting her elderly mother. James Park's wife and daughter finally being recognized. Helen Park came forward, representing the Park family from her side. "These brave individuals lost family members to this operation," the president said. "For 70 years, they didn't know the full truth. Thanks to the courage of survivors like Margaret Chen, they finally do." The president unveiled a memorial plaque. It was simple, elegant. It bore 3 names: Private Jennifer Walsh, 1932–1953; Corporal Michael Santos, 1929–1953; Lieutenant James Park, 1925–1953. Heroes of Operation Needle Thread. They served in silence, they died with honor. "These 3 heroes will be honored at Arlington National Cemetery," the president said, "and their names will be added to the Korean War Veterans Memorial. They will no longer be forgotten." Margaret looked at Sarah, Ruth, Una, Sun Hee, and Helen. All were crying. So was she. After the ceremony, Colonel Price approached with 3 small wooden boxes. Inside were the bronze stars meant for Jennifer, Michael, and James. He gave one to Sarah, one to Ruth, one to Una and Sun Hee. "These belong to your family," he said. "They've been waiting 70 years to come home." The reception lasted hours. Margaret talked with other survivors, with family members, with veterans who wanted to thank her. She was exhausted, emotionally drained, but also at peace. That evening back at her hotel, she stood at the window looking out at the monuments lit up against the night sky: the Washington Monument, the Lincoln Memorial, the Korean War Memorial, where Jennifer, Michael, and James's names would soon be added. Her phone rang. It was Dale. "I've been watching the coverage," he said. "You did good, Margaret. Really good. It doesn't feel like enough. It never does. But it's something. And something is better than the nothing that came before." Margaret returned home to find her life forever changed. Her shop became a destination. People came from all over to meet her, to see where she worked, to hear her story. She hired help to manage the tailoring business so she could focus on speaking engagements and interviews. She worked with historians to document Operation Needle Thread properly. She connected with the other survivors, forming friendships that felt like family. The Smithsonian announced they were creating an exhibit about the operation. They asked for artifacts. Margaret donated her uniform, the one with the coded stitches that had started everything. The exhibit opened 6 months later. It was massive. It took up an entire wing of the museum. It featured uniforms, photographs, decoded messages, video testimonies from survivors. It told the full story of Operation Needle Thread, from its conception in 1952 through its termination in 1953 to its declassification 70 years later. Margaret attended the opening with Dale, Sarah, Ruth, Una, Sun Hee, and dozens of others connected to the story. The Smithsonian had arranged for all surviving Operation Needle Thread operatives and family members of the deceased to attend. It was the largest gathering of people connected to the operation since the war ended. They stood together in front of the display case that held her uniform. "This is what courage looks like," Sarah said quietly. "A needle and thread." "Courage comes in all forms," Margaret replied. "Sometimes it's charging into battle. Sometimes it's sitting in a tent in the dark, sewing messages that could get you killed if anyone found out." The exhibit included a memorial wall listing all 34 Operation Needle Thread operatives, 17 survivors, 14 who had died of natural causes in the years since the war, and 3 who had been killed in action. Margaret stood in front of Jennifer, Michael, and James's names for a long time. "I told your stories," she whispered. "I made sure people knew. I kept my promise. Anna Park, James's great-granddaughter, came to stand beside her. Anna was a college student now. She was studying journalism. "I'm going to write about all of this," Anna said. "About my great-grandfather. About you. About what you did. The world needs to know." "Tell it true," Margaret said. "That's all I ask." "I will." Life gradually settled into a new normal. Margaret still ran her tailor shop, though now it was more of a museum than a business. The back room held displays about Operation Needle Thread, photographs, documents, copies of declassified mission reports. And on the wall, in a place of honor, hung 3 bronze stars, the ones Colonel Price had given to the families. Sarah had asked Margaret to keep Jennifer's, saying it should stay with the story. Ruth had asked her to keep Michael's, saying Margaret had earned the right to display it. Una and Sunhee had asked her to keep James's, saying it belonged where James's story lived on. "They belong here," Sarah had said, "where people can see them, where their story lives on." Dale became a permanent part of Margaret's life. He managed the museum aspect of the shop. He coordinated with schools that wanted Margaret to speak. He became the friend she hadn't realized she needed until he appeared. One evening, as they sat in the shop after closing, Dale asked her a question he'd been wondering about for months. "Do you regret it? Any of it? The service, the hiding, the 70 years of silence?" Margaret thought for a long time. "I regret that people died. I regret that Jennifer and Michael and James never got to come home. I regret that their families had to wait 70 years for answers. I regret that so many of us died without ever being recognized for what we did. But do I regret serving? Do I regret trying to make a difference? No. Never. Even with everything that happened, even with all the pain and the hiding and the guilt, I'd do it again in a heartbeat." Really? Really? Because what we did mattered. We saved lives. We made a difference. And that's worth any cost. 2 years after the White House ceremony, Margaret received a letter from a high school student in Oregon named Emma Walsh. She was writing a history project about the Korean War and had chosen Operation Needle Thread as her topic. "I chose this subject because my great-grandmother was Private Jennifer Walsh," Emma wrote. "I never got to meet her. She died before I was born, and my family never talked about her much. But after your interview came out, after the truth was finally told, I learned she was a hero. I learned she did something brave and important. I learned I come from courage. Thank you for making sure her memory lives on. Thank you for telling her story when she couldn't." Margaret wrote back immediately. They began corresponding. Margaret told Emma everything she remembered about Jennifer, about her laugh, her kindness, her bravery, about the work they'd done together, about what it meant to serve. When Emma graduated high school 2 years later, Margaret traveled to Oregon for the ceremony. Emma introduced her to the entire school as the woman who made sure my great-grandmother wasn't forgotten. The principal asked Margaret to speak. Margaret stood at the podium looking out at hundreds of young faces and thought about what to say. "I'm not a hero," she began. "I'm just someone who tried to do the right thing when it mattered. Jennifer Walsh was a hero. Michael Santos was a hero. James Park was a hero. They gave everything for their country, and then their country forgot them. For 70 years, they were ghosts, names in sealed files, secrets that were never supposed to be told." She paused. "Don't let that happen again. Whatever you choose to do with your lives, whatever paths you take, remember the people who came before you. Remember their sacrifices. Tell their stories. Make sure they're not forgotten. Because silence should never be the final answer. Truth matters, memory matters, recognition matters, even if it comes 70 years late." The auditorium erupted in applause. After the ceremony, Emma approached with her parents and grandparents. Emma's grandmother, Jennifer's daughter, looked at Margaret with tears in her eyes. "I never knew my mother," she said. "She died before I was born. For my whole life, she was just a sad story my father wouldn't talk about. Just a young woman who died in Korea. That's all I knew. But now, because of you, I know who she really was. What she really did. How brave she was. Thank you for giving me my mother back." They embraced. 3 generations connected by one woman's courage and another woman's testimony. Sun Hee Park visited several times over the following years. Each visit, she brought Anna, who was now in journalism school. Anna interviewed Margaret extensively, recording hours of audio, taking detailed notes. She was working on a book that would tell the story of Operation Needle Thread from the perspective of the families left behind. "This isn't just a war story," Anna explained. "It's a story about silence and truth, about what we owe to people who serve us, about how easily we forget, about how important it is to remember." Una Park passed away peacefully 2 years after the White House ceremony. She was 93 years old. Margaret attended her funeral, stood beside Sun Hee as they buried her, held Anna's hand as the chaplain spoke. "She died knowing the truth," Sun Hee told Margaret afterward. "She died knowing my father was a hero. She died at peace. Because of you." Margaret lived to see the 5th anniversary of the declassification. By then, only 9 of the original 17 survivors remained. Thomas Yee had died the year before. Sun Hee Park had moved to a nursing home with dementia. Time was claiming them, one by one, but at least they had received their recognition before the end. They gathered at Arlington National Cemetery for a memorial service honoring the 3 who had been killed in action. 3 headstones had been erected, even though there were no bodies to bury. The stones bore their names, their ranks, their dates, and a simple inscription: "Heroes of Operation Needle Thread." Margaret stood between Sarah Walsh and Ruth Santos as a military chaplain spoke. Helen Park had passed away the year before, but her children were there to represent her. After the service, Margaret placed her hand on James Park's headstone. "We made it, James," she whispered. "We finally made it home." Margaret Chen died peacefully in her sleep on a cold November morning, 3 months shy of her 76th birthday. She was found by Dale, who had come to open the shop. She had passed quietly during the night. The medical examiner said it was a stroke. Painless. Quick. The way everyone hopes to go, but few actually do. Her obituary ran on the front page of the New York Times. Margaret Chen, last surviving member of Korean War Intelligence Operation, dies at 75. The article told her whole story. Margaret Chen and Margaret Hwan, the nurse and the operative. The young woman who had sewn messages and the old woman who had finally told the truth. Her funeral was attended by hundreds, veterans, government officials, students she'd spoken to, families of the people she'd served with. The current president sent a representative. The Secretary of Defense spoke. Sarah Walsh, now a major, delivered the eulogy. "Margaret Chen taught us that heroism isn't always loud," Sarah said. "Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's a needle and thread in a dark tent while artillery thunders outside. Sometimes it's carrying a secret for 70 years and then finding the courage to speak it aloud. She gave my great-grandmother a voice. She gave all of them voices. She made sure they weren't forgotten. And now we have to make sure she isn't forgotten either." Margaret was buried in her uniform. The original one. The one with the stitches that had saved Dale's father. The one that had started everything. The Smithsonian had returned it for her burial. On her headstone they carved both her names, Margaret Chen, Margaret Hwan. Both versions of herself finally united, finally whole. And below that, a single line. She sewed messages that saved lives. Simple, true, complete. Dale bought the tailor shop. He didn't change it. He kept it as Hwan's Tailoring and Alterations. Hired a tailor to run the business, but he also turned the back room into a permanent museum about Operation Needle Thread. He displayed Margaret's medals, her photographs, copies of declassified documents, the uniform from his father that Margaret had sewn the warning into, the 3 bronze stars that had belonged to Jennifer, Michael, and James. And on the wall, he hung a large photograph of all 34 Operation Needle Thread operatives. Most were grainy military ID photos, but they were all there, all named, all remembered, all honored. The sign above the door still read, "Hwan's Tailoring and Alterations." But underneath, Dale added a new line. "Home of Margaret Chen, Operation Needle Thread Hero, 1930-2006. People came from all over to visit, to see where Margaret had worked, to learn her story, to understand what courage looked like. And in the front window, in a place of honor, Dale placed a single needle and a spool of thread on a small velvet cushion. A card beside it read, "The tools of a hero, the weapon of truth, the thread that connected past and present, in memory of Margaret Chen and all who served in silence." Anna Park's book was published 2 years after Margaret's death. It was titled Silent Heroes, The Story of Operation Needle Thread. It became a bestseller. It was made into a documentary. The documentary won an Academy Award. In her acceptance speech, Anna held up the Oscar and said, "This is for Margaret Chen, for Jennifer Walsh, for Michael Santos, for my great-grandfather James Park, for everyone who served in silence. We see you now. We remember you now. We honor you now. And we always will." 10 years after Margaret's death, Emma Walsh graduated from West Point. She was commissioned as a second lieutenant in Army intelligence. At her graduation, she wore 2 things: her standard officer's insignia and a small jade pendant on a thin gold chain. Margaret had left it to her in her will. "This belonged to my grandmother," the note had said, "and before her, to her grandmother. It has protected 3 generations of women who served their country. Now it's yours. Wear it with pride. Remember where you came from, and never be afraid to tell the truth, even when it's hard." Emma wore it to her first day of duty, and every day after. The legacy continued. 20 years after the declassification, the Army officially renamed their intelligence training facility. It became the Chen Walsh Santos Park Training Center, named for 4 heroes who had served in silence and finally been recognized. A statue was erected at the entrance. It showed a young woman in an Army nurse uniform, sitting at a table, needle and thread in hand. The plaque at the base read, "In honor of all who served in Operation Needle Thread, 1953. They sewed silence into voice. They sewed secrets into truth. They sewed courage into history." And every year on July 11th a ceremony was held at Arlington National Cemetery. Veterans and families gathered at the 3 headstones. Someone would read the names, Jennifer Walsh, Michael Santos, James Park, and someone would tell their stories, making sure they were never forgotten, making sure the silence was never final, making sure the truth lived on, because a tailor shop in a small town had held a secret for 70 years. And when that secret finally emerged, it changed everything. One needle at a time, one stitch at a time, one truth at a time, until silence became story, until ghosts became heroes, until the forgotten became unforgettable. And a simple jade pendant on a thin gold chain continued to protect another generation of brave women who served their country with honor. The needle had come home, and the thread would never be broken.